Last year, voters in Maine passed a ballot initiative to switch their voting system over to what's called a ranked choice voting system. Now, there's a good chance if you're watching this show, you are familiar with what that is. It was talked about a good amount during the last round of primaries because it's widely seen as one of the ways, among other things, that it's intended to fix a lot of problems that third-party candidates could potentially make more headway in US elections. Now, it's important to know that up until right now in the US, it's used for some types of elections in 11 US cities, uniformly blue cities. But they passed this ballot initiative in Maine to switch over their voting system. Not for presidential races, just for the statewide races, but it is certainly something. Now, if you're not familiar with this or how it would actually function, here's a brief overview, although I recommend you read more up on this because there's a lot of interesting information. Instead of casting a ballot for a single candidate the way you do now, the voter would rank all of their candidates by preference. So if there were 4 people running for Congress, you would say I vote this guy number 1, her number 2, them number 3, whatever. If no one wins a majority on the first round of voting, which is actually often the case in a lot of races, the candidate with the fewest votes would be eliminated. For voters, that means if the eliminated candidate was your first choice, your second choice vote would be applied in the next round of counting. And so the idea there is, right now you have to make this decision between backing one candidate. And if it's a candidate that doesn't have a very high chance of voting, in many cases it might be that in terms of affecting the election, votes could be wasted. That may not be the right term, but the candidate doesn't get voted for or doesn't get elected. But with this sort of system, you could vote for whoever you want. And if there's no plurality, if they get 3%, 5%, 10%, and nobody gets over 50%, then your second place candidate would still have your support. And so it would free people up to support candidates that right now the system sort of tries to stop you from supporting. And that's not the way everyone would describe the system, but that's one of the ways that I see it anyway. Now, this is not common in the US, as I said, but ranked choice voting is used in Ireland and Australia. Also, it's how they pick Oscar nominees for Best Picture, which I thought was an interesting little fact. So they passed it in a ballot initiative. Look at that. People in Maine decide that the way the system works right now isn't delivering the results that they want. And they're not just looking to get one person in there. They're looking to change the system, to take matters into their own hands because the legislature wouldn't act. Unfortunately, then the legislature did act and they delayed the law's execution until 2021. Which in my experience is their way of delaying it until the end of time. Because that's a lot of time to delay and delay and delay. And so under the current system, lawmakers will have until the 2022 elections when you have the choice to vote for Donald Trump Jr. or Eric Trump to amend the law to make it constitutional or else face a full repeal. So not only is it delayed, but it will only go into effect at that point if they also amend the Constitution. And so all the people who worked so hard to pass this ballot initiative were like, no, you're not just gonna shut down our efforts. And so as of today, I believe it was today, a judge has decreed that they can have 90 days to collect over 60,000 signatures to place a people's veto of effectively the veto on the ballot. And so that's a lot of signatures to gather in a short period of time in a state like Maine. But today, actually, there are hundreds of volunteers going around the state trying to gather those signatures. This is something that already had a lot of support in Maine, and now I think after the Republican attempt to shut it down, people should be more interested in this. They should be more passionate about this issue. So hopefully you have already sought out and put down your signature for that if you live in Maine.
Yeah, and actually if you live in Maine, you can go to them. You don't have to wait for them to come to your door. It's the Committee for Ranked Choice Voting Maine, or RCV Maine. So go to them, make it easy. Sign their petition and then get your ballot initiative.
Exactly.
But how many times does Maine have to vote to get the same thing? Poor Maine.
At least a few times, and that's the thing that scares me. So thank you for pointing that out. Don't wait for them to come to you. It's a small state, but a couple hundred people could still not get to you. Go find them, and if you have a little bit of extra time, maybe you can help to gather signatures. I mean, 60,000 ain't nothing, but if enough people sign up, each person only has to get so many signatures, and then the people's will can actually be made into law. And importantly, as was supposed to be the case in US history, we've got 50 states. There's supposed to be these laboratories of democracy where we can try something out in one state or 5 or 10 and see, how it's going. Like Colorado just passed how many years with legal marijuana? 5 or something? Last time I checked, it wasn't Mad Max there. So apparently it doesn't have to destroy your country. These things are useful. So it would be great to see Maine using that. Now, just a little bit of background on why it is that the Republicans might have shut this down. You should know that the state's current governor, Republican Paul LePage, first took office in a 3-way race in which he got only a plurality of the vote in a contest against Democratic and independent candidates. I've run all the numbers, but it's possible that had they had that system, he would not be governor today. And he wouldn't have been there to make racist remarks about out-of-state drug dealers, and he wouldn't have been there to shut down expansion of Medicaid to low and middle-income Mainers. So that would have been interesting. It's also possible that if in other cases, like if in the Republican primary, if they had run that through ranked choice, I don't think Donald Trump would be your president right now.
Maybe not.
Because you had the establishment weak spineless Republican vote split amongst a whole bunch of establishment weak spineless individuals. And that wouldn't have necessarily been the case had they had something like this. Anyway, one other thing that I wanted to mention though is that this, I'm not saying it's a pattern yet, but the legislature shutting down this sort of effort reminded us here at TYT of another thing that happened, and that was in South Dakota when the people passed a anti-corruption ballot measure. And so what that was designed to do was it stopped certain sorts of gifts being given from lobbyists to politicians. It set up an independent organization in government to check for corruption and things like that. It was wider than that, but that was a few of the things that they did. And the legislature just said, no, we're not gonna let you set this up to constrain our activities, and they shut it down. And so it's great to see people getting out there and trying to reform the system, but we have to make sure that the politicians don't shut down those reforms before they can do what they're intended to do.
Support independent media. Come join us at the Young Turks. TYTnetwork.com/join.